Hi all! Again, I will start this episode with editing Casper. Since I wrote and recorded this episode, a lot of my thoughts about groups mentioned in this episode and other things mentioned have changed. I will still release the episode as I put effort into it and it's an important conversation to have. I still agree with some of the stuff that I said, but I don't agree with all of it. If you want to hear a brief overview of my updated opinions, I will include a small segment about that at the end of the video. The Mnet K-pop survival show Boys Planet ended in April 2023, creating the group Zero Base One, who went on to break records that had stood for decades and to just generally be massively successful. But even as the show finished, Mnet began promoting the group as the start of the fifth generation of K-pop, a move that became controversial for several reasons, but which reignited talks within the industry and fandom about whether the fifth generation had started and the implications for the industry. But what even is the fifth generation? Why was this announcement enough to throw the entire industry and fandom into chaos? Has the fifth gen started? What even are K-pop generations, and does there even need to be a fifth generation? This episode will be answering all of those questions and more, and we'll even include a special guest. But I'll give you a spoiler. I don't really think the fifth gen has started, and although the K-pop community as a whole seem to have decided it has started, their arguments all seem out of whack and in service to their faves rather than the situation itself. In this episode, we'll be discussing the history of K-pop generations, criteria used to measure them, and thus evaluating whether the fifth gen has actually started. We'll be analysing the need for K-pop fans to put a label on everything, and to have black and white boundaries. And we'll also be answering the age-old question of whether the boys or Stray Kids were the true first group of the fourth generation, as we take a trip through the history of K-pop to look at important and iconic groups from each generation. We discussed this a little bit in episode 2 on K-pop, but let's give a quick recap again. K-pop originated in the 1980s and 1990s in Korea, and used both American and Japanese musical culture to create a new industry with the goal of becoming popular internationally and trumping both industries. It has since become hugely popular, primarily through groups debuting in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and is now a massive and carefully curated industry which produces performers who are literally too good to be true. Thus why they are called idols. K-pop fans, like fans of many things, like to split K-pop groups into generations. There are various definitions for generations which we'll cover later, but the largest one seems to be the characteristics of the groups and artists debuting. No one is entirely sure when the term generations started being used to refer to K-pop groups, or who came up with it, but it seems likely that it was the early to mid-2000s. As of the time that I started listening to K-pop, early 2020, it was generally accepted that there were 4 generations in K-pop. Some people stuck to the idea that there were 3, but there was pretty solid evidence for 4, so that was what most people went with. The first generation ran from roughly the late 1980s, when K-pop began, to the early 2000s, when it started becoming more popular internationally. The second generation ran from roughly the mid-2000s to the early 2010s, and the third generation ran from the early 2010s to the late 2010s, making it possibly the shortest generation in K-pop. The fourth generation started in the late 2010s and may or may not still be ongoing. And then there's the fifth gen, which is, of course, the topic of this video. But what I've just given you is very vague, and it's vague on purpose, because there are many ways that K-pop generations can and have been categorized, and it's hard to mention them all in one sentence. So let's take a look at all the ways that people have tried to categorize them. There are a few ways that K-pop generations have been categorized by fans. Keep in mind that none of these, not even the first one which goes by year, are set in stone. There is overlap between generations in all of these categories, and thus there has been at least some level of discourse as to who was the first and who was the last, and so on. But there's always a grey area with something as subjective and quickly evolving as K-pop. The first is by year. There seems to be a common idea on the internet that K-pop generations last 5 years. This would make second gen go from roughly 2007 to 2012, third gen from 2012 to 2017, and fourth gen from 2017 to 2022. But there are obvious issues with this. The first being that second gen arguably started earlier than 2007, the second being that almost no one thinks fourth gen ended in 2022, and the last being the most obvious. What do we do with first gen? K-pop as a genre originated in the 1980s. So, if we stick with the 5-year concept, we'd currently be entering the 8th generation. And I don't think anyone thinks there have been 8 K-pop generations. It also doesn't really make sense for the first generation to be the only exception to this rule, because K-pop has always moved fast even back then. This generally also follows the idea that K-pop generations are decided by the length of the group's contract. For instance, second gen ended at the start of the 2010s, not because of a shift in music or fan culture, but because the contracts of those groups, generally 7 years long, were beginning to expire and new groups were replacing them. This is a relatively silly argument, since groups of the same generation have overlapping contracts. Thus, there isn't a clear endpoint. And that's not even taking into account groups that renew their contracts. For instance, BTS and 17 are considered to be from the third gen. BTS's contract was supposed to end in 2020, but 17's contract would end in 2022. Both of these end dates were after the supposed start of the fourth generation in 2017 to 2018. So it just doesn't really make sense. And what about a group that is at the end of the third generation, like Fromis9? Are they third or fourth generation? Their contracts would expire in 2024, so is that the real end of the third generation? It's not a very good measure, and thankfully it isn't one that is used often. Second, we can categorize generations by how globally popular they are. This would make the first generation popular in Korea, but advertising internationally. Second gen the start of the international growth with groups like SHINee and Super Junior. Third gen the start of the global K-pop boom with TWICE, Blackpink, BTS and EXO. And fourth gen groups that are already popular internationally from debut or pre-debut. This is something that most people seem ready to accept, but it leaves us with the question of the fifth generation. What do they become? The current groups touted as fifth gen groups are ones that were popular internationally pre-debut and early after debut. But this is the same as fourth gen. I don't think anyone is arguing that aespa is fifth gen, for example, but they've become popular internationally from pre-debut, partially because they were from a big company. So this would suggest that we've basically reached the peak of K-pop as such, and that there is nothing else, or at least nothing else we can foresee, that would take us from being in the fourth gen to the fifth gen. The next argument is based on the debut of important groups. This method isn't really seen, but uses the debut of certain groups that changed up the industry to mark the start and end of generations. For instance, the debut of groups like HOT would mark the start of the first generation. The debut of SHINee and Big Bang would be the start of second gen, the debut of EXO and BTS the start of the third, and the debut of Stray Kids and The Boys as the start of the fourth. Notice, by the way, how all of these groups are boy groups. This, however, does have a few problems. For instance, it ignores the development of the industry before the debut of HOT, generally considered the first K-idol group, but not necessarily the start of the K-pop industry. It is also a method that only works in hindsight. For instance, when BTS debuted, no one would have been able to predict that they would become so big that they would be the face of a generation and would influence the fourth gen. We only know that now, and can only know that now because we have the hindsight of BTS's massive success. Finally, we have the argument that each generation has added something to or expanded on the industry. The first generation were the foundations of the industry and thus took a little bit longer to get off the ground. The second generation helped expand the genre and introduced more complex choreographies. SHINee and Girls' Generation were great examples of this. The third generation had a much greater focus on choreographies in general. BTS and EXO were, of course, pioneers of this. Third gen also skyrocketed the international popularity of the industry. Fourth gen was defined by how heavily polished the groups were. Everyone in the group was an all-rounder and all of the members had extensive dance training, as opposed to third gen groups where only some of the members were trained. Fourth gen groups also made greater use of social medias and started with a larger international fan base, riding off the success of third gen. By this argument, we would need to consider what fifth gen would bring to the table. They aren't all better dancers because that's what fourth gen did. Similarly, fourth gen were highly polished and started with international fan bases, so those also don't work. We could argue that fifth gen will become more like influencers than regular idols, but again, fourth gen did this a lot too, especially with people like Wonyoung and Yeonjun. If we accept Mnet's argument that Zero Base One are fifth gen, perhaps fifth gen will be defined by less stigma around the need to be perfect. Zero Base One are a fascinating case study, with older members, members with tattoos, members who say the most random things they can think of with seemingly no thought for their idol image, a BL actor, and a foreign centre who's heterophobic. Thus, we could consider them as being a mark of a more lax culture in the industry, but these are still things that groups from previous generations have done, so I wouldn't consider this a mark of a new generation. Some other arguments are that the age of the members should be grouped. For example, most third-gen idols are born from 1991 to 2000. I think this is trash and arbitrary, especially in an industry with such huge age ranges and which is obsessed with debuting minors. Another one is whether groups were eligible for award shows in any given year. Another useless and arbitrary measure similar to the length of contracts. The industry is hugely variant, so any measure of generations that doesn't account for this variation is a poorly founded one. But let's put aside the fifth gen for now and just consider the 4 generations we definitely have. Who were the first and last groups in each one and why? First, I need to say, as I mentioned earlier, that there are a lot of grey areas and undefined boundaries between generations. Thus, there is no definitive first group in a generation. We can only do the best job we can at sorting them. In this section, I'll try and discuss some notable artists from the start and end of each generation. These artists are also usually the exemplary examples of groups from their generations. Well, first gen was mostly defined by being more abstract, less put together and less defined. So it's less about groups and more about artists in general. But either way, some groups and artists at the beginning of the generation were Saltaji and the Boys, HOT, SES, Baby Vox, and so on. These groups were characterized by their similarities to Japanese and American groups of the time, and were, of course, far less polished than we would expect today. They also, of course, had that peak 1990s and early 2000s fashion. Although these groups came from the early and mid-90s, I have stated that K-pop likely originated in the 1980s, as this is when the seeds of the industry would have originated. The inspirations of American and Japanese pop, rock, and rap, and the beginnings of planning these groups. The end of the first generation and the beginning of the second is far harder to define. Most people seem to believe the second generation started in around 2008 with the debut of groups like SHINee, but other groups like Big Bang and Super Junior are often considered second gen, even though they debuted earlier. Some people say there is a kind of Generation 1.5 in around 2003 to 2008, which bridged the gap between the two generations, but others disagree with this. As far as me, well, I would say that some of the groups in 2003 to 2008 definitely fit into first gen and some fit into second gen. Groups like TVXQ are pretty solidly considered first gen, and follow all of the tropes of first gen, like being less polished and having less of an emphasis on choreography. On the other hand, groups like Big Bang and Super Junior could arguably fit into either generation, but are probably more suited to the second gen, which had the introduction of more complex choreographies and the solidification of the K-pop system. On either side of this time period, we have artists like BoA, Shinhwa, and God, which would probably be considered the last artists of first gen along with TVXQ, and artists like SHINee, Girls' Generation, and FX, which were the first groups of the second generation. So, first gen was categorized by being more abstract and basically being the foundation of the industry. The first solidly first gen artist is Soltaji and the Boys, and the last major one is TVXQ. Some artists who exemplify the generation are HOT, Shinhwa, SES, BoA, and God. We then have a few artists who could either fit into first or second generation, but mostly fit into second gen, like Big Bang and Super Junior. Then we have the first groups of second gen, starting with Super Junior in 2005 and Big Bang in 2006. Or, if you don't consider these groups second gen for whatever reason, the next and thus first group of second gen would be Wonder Girls in 2007, followed in the same year by Kara and Girls' Generation, and then SHINee in 2008. These groups were followed up by 2PM, Tiara, 2NE1, FX, Infinite, Sister, and so on. While first gen was dominated by boy groups, interestingly second gen was dominated by girl groups. I say interestingly because these days, looking back, we don't really realise, at least if you're like me and became a K-pop fan after second gen, how prevalent girl groups were. This is probably because most of the second gen groups that exist today and continue to promote, SHINee, Super Junior, Infinite, are all boy groups and thus have clouded our judgment. But looking back at the actual groups that debuted and the ones which were popular, most of them are girl groups. Some exemplary groups of second gen are SHINee, 2NE1, and Girls' Generation. All of these groups were more put together than first gen groups, as the K-pop system had now been relatively solidified. They were, however, still experimental, as although the system was solidified, the style wasn't quite, not yet. These groups also crucially placed much more emphasis on choreographies, and choreographies became a big part of the groups and their storytelling. Hopefully, I don't need to tell you that SHINee were exemplars of this. They are literally known for creating K-pop choreography dance videos, and were one of the first groups to have complex and intense choreographies, which required a lot of skill and coordination from the members. This generation was also known for creating some of the most iconic songs which have enduring popularity to this day, and which have influenced many later artists. These songs may even be known by newer K-pop fans who don't actually know any second or first gen groups. Here are some of the iconic songs.
fantastic, baby. Dance. I wanna dance, 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 dance. Fantastic, baby. Dance. I wanna dance, 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 dance. Wow, fantastic, baby.
내가 제일 잘 나가. 내가 제일 잘 나가. 내가 제일 잘 나가. 내가 제일 잘 나가. 제일 잘 나가. 겁이 나서 시작조차 안 해봤다면 그댄 투덜대지 마라 좀. 주저하면 기회는 모두 너를 비켜가. 가슴 펴고 나와 봐라 좀. Try my boy, but bring the boys out. Girls generation make you feel the heat. 전 세계가 너를 주목해. But bring the boys out. 위풍도 당당하지 뼛속부터는. 밤늦게 나가서 놀면 좀 어때? 어쩌다 전화 안 받으면 어때? 왜 자꾸 그래 너 나를 못 믿니? 너에게 날 맞추지 마. 나에게 더 바라지 마. 거품처럼 커진 밤을 버블 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 팝 버블 버블 팝.
Second gen is categorized also by its increases in global popularity. Where first gen initiated the fan culture of K-pop and put it on the Korean music map, second gen really put it on the global map, something which third gen would solidify. Anyway, around 2010 to 2012, we get the end of the second gen and the start of third gen. This is another grey period between generations, but is, thankfully, far shorter and less grey than the gap between first and second gen. That said, there are still some groups which are in the middle. For instance, my coworker and I debated a lot of these groups. We didn't have a lot of information on BAP, so couldn't decide. We argued about EXID, NU'EST, and B2B. I argued that B2B and EXID are second gen while NU'EST are third gen, while she argued that all three are third gen, citing their musical styles. On the other hand, I cited choreography as a reason NU'EST are third gen and the lack thereof as a reason B2B are second gen. I didn't have a good argument for EXID, not going to lie. I was just always under the impression that they were second gen. When Googling, it seems that the internet generally seems to think that all three are third gen groups, although they are rarely mentioned in breakdowns of the generations, probably because they weren't as popular as the groups that solidified generations like EXO, BTS, and TWICE. In fact, the internet also seems to think that BAP are third gen. Anyway, the moral of the story is that there is a grey area between groups, but I'll discuss that more later. Putting aside the arguments my coworker and I had, we both agreed that EXO were definitely third gen, as I think most K-pop fans can agree on. This means that the final groups of second gen would be the likes of Miss A, Brave Girls, Block B, and so on. The first groups of third gen would be BAP at the start of 2012, followed by NU'EST, EXID, B2B, and so on. If you don't consider any of these groups to be third gen, don't worry, because EXO debuted in mid-2012 and were 100% a third-gen group. They were followed as one of the first third-gen groups by AOA and VIX later in 2012, and then by BTS in 2013 and Red Velvet in 2014. Third-gen was a massive period of growth in the industry, both in terms of popularity and the solidification of the K-pop style. It has also arguably some of the most popular groups of all time: BTS, Blackpink, TWICE, EXO, Red Velvet, and so on. Third gen as a generation was characterized by an increasing emphasis on dance and choreography. Groups like BTS were pioneers of insane choreographies like Blood, Sweat and Tears and Dionysus. It was also, of course, the explosion of global K-pop popularity, and thus created a massive explosion of many new artists debuting. Something else that characterized third-gen groups was the massive and rapid image shift. It can be easily seen in groups like BTS, EXO, and Red Velvet. These groups debuted when YouTube was starting to become big, when online streaming and the internet were becoming more widespread, and when HD media was beginning. This means that we see edgy, grainy, early 2000s looking videos at the start of their careers, and then a massive shift in image and technology, usually becoming brighter and more sophisticated in their later years. This showed the ability of the K-pop industry to adapt to new platforms and mediums, with live streaming, YouTube, and later Spotify being huge for the industry. The ability of the industry to adapt is one of its greatest strengths, and this was really shown in third gen. In 2017, K-pop was changing again off the back of third gen, and we got yet another transitional period, although this one had some unique characters. K-pop was becoming even more polished than it had already been. Groups were debuting with dancers who were at the peak of their game, rather than growing over time as groups like BTS did. K-pop had been around, and popular enough now, for companies to have developed huge trainee systems, which allowed for the groups that would debut next. Fourth gen thus saw a massive increase in emphasis on dance, and subsequently a much smaller emphasis on singing and rapping skills. It also had a greater emphasis on visuals and made even more extensive and curated use of the internet. These groups also had a unique musical style. Noise music, girl crush, self-love, and cool boys became very popular concepts, appealing to newer K-pop fans, with the downside of many older fans calling the groups, and especially boy groups, stagnant and samey. The birth of fourth gen is also where we saw the origins of some of the biggest artists today. So let's talk about the transitional period and the start of fourth gen. This transitional period was mostly 2017, and some of the groups that debuted during it were Dreamcatcher, LOONA, Ace, 101, and The Boys. These groups all fit into the transitional period very solidly. They all had much stronger dance lines and much more complex choreographies than a lot of third gen groups, but before the solidification of fourth gen. Basically, as far as concept and dance, 101, Dreamcatcher, and Ace were all third gen groups, while I think LOONA and The Boys kind of dripped over into fourth gen. However, there is an issue with LOONA, that being that the members debuted one by one, then in subunits, and then in a group, the opposite of what groups usually do. The first member debuted solo in 2016, so very solidly third gen. So do we consider LOONA third or fourth gen? Well, colloquially they are considered a fourth gen group, but I think they are better put in third gen. Not only because that was their origin, but also because their concept, which focused on being unique and innovative, was more suited to third gen than fourth gen. The Boys are another argument. Mind you, the only people who really argue they are third gen are 1. The people who define generations by years, and 2. Angry stays who want Stray Kids to be the first fourth gen group. Well, I would personally consider them very solidly fourth gen. Not only are they a dance-focused group with a large portion of dance-trained members, but they also have that very iconic fourth gen boy group sound and image. Songs like The Stealer, Maverick, Reveal, Thrill Ride, and more fit in very well with other groups of that generation. Alternatively, they do also have some very third gen songs, namely ones that I would feel would fit 101, like Bloom Bloom, No Air, and DDD. But considering 101 were about as close to fourth gen as you could actually get without actually being fourth gen, I think it makes sense. The Boys have just tipped over that line, thus making them fourth gen. Interestingly, Fromis 9, often, or at least as far as I know, considered third gen, debuted after The Boys. This is another indication that the grey period is well and truly grey. That said, I think this also makes sense, since boy groups seemed for some reason to reach the 4th gen style faster than girl groups. While a lot of boy groups were influenced by 101 and BTS, the latter of which literally defined the move towards 4th gen, girl groups were more inspired by groups like Twice and Red Velvet, which had very solidly 3rd gen and 2nd gen inspired concepts which didn't attempt much to do anything revolutionary, other than Red Velvet having multiple concepts, something which would become a key part of 4th gen. Does that make any sense? I hope so. So basically, that makes the last 3rd gen group From Us 9, and the first 4th gen group, The Boys, closely followed in 2018 by Stray Kids, GWSN, Idol, ATEEZ, and IZ*ONE. A lot of these groups became very large in the industry because, as the start of a new generation, they were unique and provided something that appealed to people. They also had the advantage of being at the start of a generation. Thus, when it became more stagnant later, these guys were seen as the pioneers, and thus, despite being similar to others, had maintained that air of originality. So, 4th gen continued on, and thus we get to 2023, where Mnet, YG, JYP, SM, and other companies claim that the 5th gen has started. Whether there was sufficient evidence that it started is something we'll talk about in the next section, but for now, let's humour them and look at the first and last groups. The last groups of 4th gen would thus be groups like Kep1er, Tempest, LE SSERAFIM, NMIXX, New Jeans, Mave, 50/50, Limelight, and Zykas, while the first groups of 5th gen are those like Zero Base One, Kiss of Life, and so on. As you can see, there is a high concentration of popular girl groups here, something which also happened in 2nd gen. There is also a focus here on groups whose songs are designed to go viral, rather than tell a story or anything else. Kep1er literally had a storyline set up for them from the beginning of the show, and Mnet threw it out the window in favour of chasing after the next greatest thing in K-pop, something which gave them no musical identity and thus which disappointed a lot of fans. So let's sum up the first and last groups of each generation subjectively. 1st gen begins with Saltaji and the Boys and ends with TVXQ and God. Some exemplar groups of the time are those like HOT and SES. Although the transitional period between most generations lasts about a year or so, the transitional period between 1st and 2nd gen was surprisingly long, probably reflecting how the industry started to change slowly and sped up over time. In this case, it lasted about 5 years, hence why it can be called Generation 1.5. After that, 2nd gen begins with Big Bang and Super Junior and ends with Block B, A-Pink, and Brave Girls. Some exemplar groups include SHINee, Girls' Generation, FX, and 2NE1. 3rd gen begins with groups like EXO and BTS, and then ends with groups like 101, From Us 9, KARD, Dreamcatcher, and so on. Exemplar groups include BTS, EXO, Twice, Red Velvet, Blackpink, and so on. 4th gen begins with the debut of the Boys and Stray Kids, and if we are to say it ends with groups like Zykas, who have possibly become the last major 4th gen group. Exemplar groups include Stray Kids, IZ*ONE, IVE, LE SSERAFIM, and so on. They had a large number of female exemplar groups, which would define the end of the generation. If 5th gen is to exist, it begins with Zero Base One and Kiss of Life, and would, of course, be ongoing. It's important to note that all of this is subjective and that there are grey areas between generations, because these generations are inherently nuanced and subjective, so don't just take my word for it, form your own opinions. Anyway, I hope that after all of that, stays can stop attacking the boys, but I kind of doubt that stays can stop attacking anyone. Also, I'm sorry if I didn't mention one of your favourite groups. I didn't mention some of my alts either. I just wanted to narrow the list down as far as possible. As the show Boys Planet reached its end and created the group Zero Base One earlier this year, Mnet, the company behind the group and show, put out a statement announcing that the new group would be the start of 5th gen. Afterwards, other companies came out, like YG and SM, announcing that their upcoming groups would also be 5th gen groups. The fans went wild, and widespread debates started about whether this was actually the start of 5th gen. The industry generally seems to have accepted the start of the 5th generation, especially with the record-breaking debut of Zero Base One, but there are still a few pockets of people who think this is all BS, to some extent, myself included. The main reason for this is that there doesn't seem to be any actual reason to claim the start of the 5th gen. It seems like a few big companies put out a statement with no evidence, and likely with the purpose of getting their groups the title of, quote, the first group of 5th gen, and then everyone just accepted it. If a company can just announce whichever title they want for their groups, is there really any point to generations anymore? They won't be based on actual evidence and instead on advertising. I discussed this a little bit earlier, but there have been no real arguments for why the 5th gen should start now. If we're going on a year-based or contract-based system, we should be in either the 8th generation or still firmly in 3rd gen. If we're going on how internationally popular they are, there is no difference between early and late 4th gen groups and 5th gen groups. We could argue that it's by the debut of important groups, and that would make sense, in that important groups do define their generations, but that would mean that we are already very firmly in 5th generation with the debut of groups like New Jeans, LE SSERAFIM and IVE, not just starting it with Zero Base One. Interestingly though, this would mean the 5th generation would be the first one defined by the debut of girl groups, making Zero Base One an outlier. However, defining the generations by who debuted and who was popular is, first, something that can only really be done in retrospect, and second, something that is very dodgy to use as a definition, since we could have had anywhere between 3 and 40 generations based on what the bar is for a popular group and debut. That said, the debut of many girl groups could be a marker of 5th gen, and is one that I would personally attribute to Brave Girls and IZ*ONE, further solidifying the link between 5th and 2nd gen that I have teased throughout this video. If we're going by what generations add to the industry, which is, in my opinion, by far the best categorization, and the one that most people seem to use anyway, there is literally no reason to think that 5th gen has started now. They aren't better dancers than 4th gen, they aren't more popular internationally than 4th gen, they aren't making different use of social media to 4th gen, and they aren't redefining the industry in any meaningful way that 4th gen didn't already do. Zero Base One have broken records, sure, but that doesn't make them a 5th gen group if the only thing they did differently from other groups was be more popular, something which fluctuates within generations anyway. I'm all for lifting up the group, I love them and they're super talented, but they just aren't 5th gen, and from the sounds of things, it seems like this needless 5th gen label has been causing them a lot of stress anyway. Let's look at a few more arguments that have been made as to why 5th gen could or should have started, varying from believable to not so much. Some people have suggested that the debut of AI groups like Plave, Mave and Superkind could mark the start of 5th gen. This argument mostly popped up after Mave gained surprising success with Pandora, but Mave haven't made a comeback since, and other AI groups have had very mediocre success. Sure, if the industry was to become more AI-oriented, that would definitely be a change worthy of labeling a new generation. But I think people jumped on the AI hype train too quickly and it kind of fizzled out without going anywhere. Or maybe in the future I'll come to regret those words. Another interesting thing I've heard is that each generation needs to have a holy trinity before we can move on to the next one. For example, the trinity of Twice, Blackpink and Red Velvet in the 3rd gen, representing YG, SM and JYP. This argument has already been discussed quite a bit in YouTube videos, and it seems that the main arguments against it are: first, why do you need there to be a holy trinity so much? And second, that 4th gen in no way could be defined by a holy trinity. Not only is there no standout girl group from YG to join it, but there are way more than just 3 massively successful groups in 4th gen, and many of them aren't from the big 3 or 4 companies. If we need to define 4th gen this way, it should either have ended long ago, or we will be stuck in it for a very long time. The industry has become less and less homogenous over time, thus making it hard for only a few groups to stand above the rest. Now, putting that aside, is it even possible for there to be a fifth gen? And if yes, what would mark that change? Well, I personally do think there could be a fifth gen, but as you may have guessed by now, that it probably hasn't started yet. It's hard to think what a fifth gen could add to the industry that it doesn't already have. We've basically reached the peak of groups being as polished as possible, and there aren't many more ways we could use the internet and social media to advertise a group. Perhaps if storylines become super popular and ARGs are commonly used in upcoming groups, we could then consider it fifth gen? But that isn't likely with how much money and effort it takes. If we actually get an AI generation with no human groups, we would get a fifth gen. If idol groups start releasing very little music and instead behaving almost entirely like influencers, that could also be the mark of a fifth gen. But it's also unlikely since fans demand new music so much. There is also a possibility that other companies apart from the main four start rising up. But this happened in 4th gen too, so it wouldn't be unique to 5th gen. Another argument is that companies are debuting younger idols now, but this was something that happened in other generations too. Taemin and Boa are examples of idols who debuted extremely young before 3rd, 4th and 5th gen. The only other thing I can think of is if we get some move kind of back to 1st or 2nd gen, where the industry becomes less strict and polished and a bit more grungy, where idols can dance provocatively with minimal backlash and where groups tend to be more outgoing and don't care about public opinion, dating scandals, and so on. This is the one thing that Zero Base One have kind of got going for them, but even so, as I said earlier, they don't break the mold to the extent that they actually mark a new generation. They aren't the new shiny, let's just say that. But no matter what I say, and no matter what others say, there will always be people who think that 5th gen has started. So instead, let's talk about those people and why the K-pop fandom as a whole seems to be obsessed with the idea of an impending 5th gen. K-pop fans seem to be obsessed with the idea of categorizing groups and things, and especially with the idea that their favorite group has the biggest and the best titles and achievements in the industry. This comes from the sense of competition that the industry creates, partially through parasocial relationships and partially because of the intense nature of award shows and music shows. This means that, although fandoms have the potential to be civil with each other and themselves, and many are, they are also in competition to be the best, and thus toxicity and the need to one-up others emerges. One of the ways we can see this is through fandoms wanting to get their groups the best and biggest awards and titles. See the debates between Hyunjin and Yeonjun fans as to who is the real it boy of 4th gen, or Wonyoung and Bahie fans attacking each other over who is an it girl. Or you can see BTS fans getting angry whenever another group is referred to as the kings or princes of K-pop or is said to pave the way. Basically, there's a lot of competition, and if there's competition, there's bound to be toxicity. But that's a discussion for the next episode. The biggest example of this for this episode is the battle between the boys fans and Stray Kids fans as to who is the real first 4th gen boy group, something which we answered earlier in this episode. But the real question I have is, why do we care? Why does it matter if the boys or Stray Kids are the first group of 4th gen? Why does there need to be a 5th gen at all? Why is there a need for a holy trinity? I mean, we have an answer to this already. It's competition and the need for K-pop fans to categorize things. But I'm genuinely asking, why? What difference does it make to the industry if the boys or Stray Kids were the first 4th gen group, other than that one fandom gets to feel a bit cooler than the other? They both have an emphasis on dance, and they both tend to produce noise music, and tend to have sexier choreographies and concepts than a lot of other 4th gen groups. They have both done international tours and have met each other and get along well. They are very similarly matched in fandom voting power and performance skills, shown when they ranked first and second on Kingdom. The only real difference made by this is that the boys being the first group is interesting since they aren't from a Big Four company. The other groups who marked the start of a new generation all came from the Big Three, or HYBE, which would be a marker of the rest of 4th Gen. Lots of popular groups like IVE, ATEEZ, Billy, Stacey, Kepler, and even Zero Base One, even if they have a big company backing them, are all from smaller companies. And many of them are also girl groups, another mark of the second part of 4th Gen. We've already talked about why the need for a Holy Trinity constrains generations and does the complete opposite of helping us categorize them, but what about the need for a 5th Gen itself? Why do we as a community feel there is so much need for a 5th Gen? Is 4th Gen not enough for us? Well, I started liking K-pop back in early 2020, and at that time there was already a lot of talk about when the 5th Gen would start. As soon as the 3rd Gen started, people wondered when 4th Gen would start, and as soon as 4th Gen started, people started wondering when 5th Gen would start. There's a constant need for progress and for groups to be continually getting better. I don't know what people think will happen, that there will be more groups they'll like in the future, that if they jump forward a few years to the next generation, their favourite group will suddenly become popular the way BTS did at the start of 4th Gen. Do they think that the future is better and brighter, so constantly feel the need to go towards it? It's bizarre because K-pop fans will constantly be looking at the future, but when they get to the future, their favourite group disbands or has to do military service or something else, and then they whine about how it came too soon and how this is the end of everything good in K-pop. Like they weren't also excitedly waiting for the next generation, which would likely mark the downfall of their faves. I just think that we as a community are way too obsessed with categorizing things, and with the fast-paced and competitive nature of the industry. What would happen if there wasn't a 5th Gen? What would happen if the 4th Gen was the last generation of K-pop, and it either went on forever or eventually died out, exactly as it is? Would that really be so bad? We would end on a note where groups got to be more equal, and where more groups than ever were successful, collaborating, had international fame, and were loved by fans. We would end off in a generation where groups were trying new things and returning to the old, and a generation where performances were so insane that you would never be able to pick your jaw off the ground. K-pop now has worldwide recognition to some extent, and although the industry is far from being good, it has become infinitely more accepting of idols dating, of deviations from social norms, especially in sexuality and gender, and has generally started to treat its artists and creatives better. Of course, I cannot reiterate enough, there are still massive issues in the industry. It has massive biases against the LGBT+ community, it is hugely sexist, and it still overworks its artists horribly. It abuses both fans and idols, is manipulative, and relies on the naivety of children to be groomed into artists who will do exactly as the company tells them. But it does this much less so than it did before. There is far to go, but if 4th Gen was the end of K-pop, would it really be so bad? Of course, as I said earlier, I am of the belief that a 5th Gen is possible. And if a 5th Gen is defined by better treatment of artists and a more moral industry in general, I would be delighted. But I don't see it happening soon, and just because there is more progress to be made doesn't mean we should ignore the progress made so far. I love labeling things, and I also feel a need to do it. But labels are only useful if they actually describe something about a phenomenon, and in the case of K-pop, the label of 5th Gen doesn't describe any change or really describe anything about the industry. Thus, it is useless. I think that we as a community, we as a society, and me myself, need to realize that not everything needs to be labeled, and not everything needs to be the biggest and best it can be. It's okay for something to just exist without a label. In fact, many forms of media analysis purposefully critique the use of labels as dividing people and perpetuating that divide. rather than helping us grow, improve, and become closer. I think there will be a 5th gen eventually, but it's okay if there isn't one, and it's okay if 4th gen continues for 10 or 20 years, or even until the end of the world. But with that hopefully cathartic segment out of the way, let's do something that I haven't ever done on this podcast or channel before. Let's talk to a guest. Now, I am a media student, but I'm a media student who is relatively new to their degree, and whose speciality is media production. So, in the spirit of good research, I decided to get the opinion of someone who is arguably more qualified to talk about this topic than me. Luckily, I had someone who was interested. I write a lot of these episodes in my downtime at work, and my colleague tends to watch me write them. She's an end-of-degree media student specialising in PR and marketing, 2 areas very related to the K-pop industry. I asked her if she wanted to be involved with any of the episodes I had planned, and she said she wanted to be in this one. So I wrote up a few questions for her and set off to ask her opinion on them. Alright, so first of all, thank you for being interested in being part of this episode. Can you please introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, my name is Mia, and I am, I guess, a K-pop fan like Casper, and we were actually colleagues, so we know each other quite well. And when she told me that she was doing these podcasts, I was really interested in it, and I was fortunate enough to be invited. So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad you're excited to be involved. Can you just tell us what you're studying, please?
Okay, so I'm studying a Bachelor of Media and Communications, and my major is Public Relations and Social Media. Yeah, just in terms of from like an academic standpoint, the K-pop industry in general is very interesting study.
Yep, I definitely agree, and that's one of the reasons I got you here. Can you tell us how long you've been a K-pop fan and which groups are your favourites?
So I've probably been a K-pop fan. I'm actually a pretty recent K-pop fan. Probably 2020 was when I started being a K-pop fan. My all-time favorite group is SHINee. I will listen to them any day. They're a fantastic group. I'm also into Stray Kids. I listen to them a lot. And recently I've been listening to a lot of Kiss of Life, which is interesting because I guess in relation to this topic, they are considered a 5th gen group. So yeah, just a wide range, not just sticking to one generation per se, but listening to a whole range.
No, that's good. I think it's good not to just stick to one generation. All right, what made you want to be involved in this episode in particular?
I remember one day, so obviously when Zero Base One was announced as a debut group, and that in a headline called them the first 5th gen artists or the beginning of the 5th gen. And I think I remember you and I at work together, and we were very I don't know, we discussed this a lot, and we were quite surprised that they announced it, and we were trying to figure out why. And I think just in general it was a really interesting topic, and I think it was something that both you and I wanted to really dig deep into and explore.
Yeah.
And I guess through this platform, through podcasting, is one great way to unpack that.
Yep, I definitely agree. If I don't know about you, but if I was to describe my stance, I think it would definitely be very critical. I have my doubts, let's just say that.
Yeah, I looked at that article and I was very confused. I was like, is this a generational shift? Like, who dictates a generational shift? It's kind of just weird and out of the blue that Mnet just, announces 5th gen. It's almost like a promotional thing, to be honest. It's like to gain attention from the media by stating that.
Definitely. Yeah. I was a bit skeptical about whether fans would actually accept that, because it was obviously a marketing ploy. Would people run with it or not? And in the end, it seems like they did.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised about that, man, K-pop fans, we're a really hard group to please sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I was shocked that like the majority of like fans, were happy to run with it.
Mm. So, that segues nicely into my next question. Speaking of the start of fifth gen, do you think it's actually starting or started?
So it's really interesting because when we thought about this topic, we were trying to fit in the parameters. We were trying to figure out what makes a generation.
Yeah.
Like, is it based on, is it based on a certain amount of years? Is it about, shifts in the way they promote or market? Is it by like the change of music or the change of dance style? Like, what dictates a generation?
Mm.
And my, and when we're looking at these arguments, like if you take into consideration each one of them, I feel like none of them really apply to fifth gen. Like for
Mm.
example, the year one where they have to be 5 to 7 years to make a generation. Like it's definitely hasn't been 5 to 7 years since the fourth gen debuted. I can't really see like a change in how they market themselves really or how they perform on social media. I mean, I personally couldn't really see a reason. I couldn't justify a reason personally on why we're in the fifth generation,
Mm.
but I feel like it's this thing where it's not based on individual opinion. It's a lot of what society dictates, and society has to like categorize things to justify why it's a certain way. I don't think it's necessarily logical to be fifth generation, but I think because everyone's like accepted it as it's just kind of just flown into fifth gen,
Yeah,
and everyone
definitely.
kind of accepted it as that type of thing.
I'll gather from what you just said earlier that you don't think the reasons for fifth gen starting are very good.
Yeah, they don't really align themselves with the regular arguments on what starts a generation. I mean, not the regular, but just like
Mm.
what people have justified in the past,
Mm.
I would say.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that we discussed quite a bit was the each generation adds something new. So obviously first gen was the foundation, second gen is dance, third gen is polishing everything, and fourth gen is mega polished. Like, what does fifth gen add to that? That's fair. Yep.
Yeah. And even when I remember you and I were sitting down, like going through all these groups, like trying to see whether this group was a certain generation, like we did butt heads sometimes, and some groups we just couldn't definitively tell which generation they belonged to.
Mm.
It was in kind of like they were kind of just in limbo between the generations. Yeah, it's very like difficult to determine, I feel like a
Yeah,
distinct
definitely.
generation.
Or when do you think that a definitive start to fifth gen would happen, if ever?
Um, if ever, that's really interesting because I feel like when I think of generational shift, so everyone has like the different like parameters for a generation
Mm.
shift.
Mm.
And I think just purely one, I don't think necessarily makes a generational shift. I think a lot of them need to like work together to make a generational shift. Like in terms of second to third generation, yes, definitely had more polished choreography. But I think what also made them different from the second gen is the use of social media.
Yep. Yep.
Um, like they were on platforms and it kind of pushed K-pop maybe like more out of like Asia, like people in the West were able to consume it because it was on the internet and on social media.
Mm. Mm.
Like there has to be multiple things to move it into, or multiple reasons for it to move into a different generation. Possibly for fifth gen, maybe if the like obviously there's like pre-debut hype
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
obviously, and us fans are really into the pre-debut hype. I think maybe one way to move it to fifth gen is that the West has pre-debut hype for a group.
Oh,
Like
like,
that really shows like its success,
do you
I
mean
feel like.
like if like late night American shows were to include pre-debut groups or something?
Yeah, possibly. It's just really cementing themselves as a global um, group. Because if you look at previous groups like coming through K-pop now,
Mm.
like most of them have had, hype and anticipation like in Korea or by fans specifically. And
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
usually until they become successful that they go to the West, really. They're really heavily marketed in the West,
Yeah. Yeah,
or like they have specific English releases. I think when there's global hype for a group, like the West is engaged and is anticipating a group, I think that might be a generational shift. It doesn't necessarily need to be one, and there are multiple factors to make the generational shift. It can't just be this, but I think that might be one instance where there could possibly generational shift.
Okay, that's fair. Do you think that a group that would be an example of what you're just talking about would be like Baby Monster?
I haven't really looked into Baby Monster much. I know that they're debuting soon.
Mm.
Possibly. It depends how big the hype is in the West.
Okay, yeah.
What I was thinking is that like you know how like Hype and JYP have like JYP debuted Vicha and
Yeah,
Hype has debuted like a global group,
yeah, Cat's
like
Eye,
not just
yeah.
strictly Cat's Eye. Maybe like if they had, Hype from the West, it would be like that would be a generational shift
Oh,
because
like,
that's really like if the West was like anticipating them, and they're really built for the West, those
mm,
groups. I mean,
mm,
not built specifically for the West, but they are there to help Western audiences will get more into to draw them into K-pop. Yeah, maybe a scenario like that. I'm gonna be honest, I really like. I have no idea. It's like I always think, where can K-pop go from here? And then all
mm.
of a sudden, it can go somewhere else, and I'm just like, oh
Yeah,
wow.
that's fair.
Like
That's okay.
I cannot predict these. Like I could never imagine these predictions
You
10 years ago.
you would have some kind of superpowers if you could predict it completely accurately.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
We've kind of touched on it, what you think defines or will define fifth gen. So you're saying perhaps hype pre-debut, especially with the general public in the West, different marketing strategies, stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, I would think so. These companies can, you know, produce hype for these groups globally, not just strictly within the fan base, I
Mm,
think.
mm.
Because a lot of people still don't like listen to K-pop, don't really know about it, because there are so many music genres in the world. But
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
like I feel like if you compare pop to K-pop, like obviously pop has been there for pop has been, has been in the West for so long, and it's reached Asia. That's like how K-pop kind of
Mm, mm.
transformed into its own like genre. It's difficult because there are always going to be people who won't listen to it or anything like that. But I think K-pop can probably do more in the West than it already is right now. Let's just say that. I think they could both definitely have a bigger impact in the West.
Okay. Yep. Just before we finish up, do you have anything else you wanted to say about this topic?
Like definitely in terms of the announcement of fifth gen was a bit crazy. Like I thought it was
Mm.
crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't think it was going to take on. I didn't think it was serious, but it's actually going ahead. And what surprised me is that this talk of fifth gen has been like around for a while. Like I remember looking at some articles from like 2020, 2021,
Yeah.
asking when does fifth gen start. And it's crazy to me because I thought we're in like straight in the middle of fourth gen, like we're peaking in fourth gen right now. Like I thought we were like going to peak in fourth gen.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it's interesting how people have been talking about it so long, and just the different theories that people have on what dictates a generation is really interesting reading.
Mm.
Obviously, you probably go into more detail on that in your section of the podcast.
Yeah, a little bit, but
But yeah,
I definitely agree that the different ways that people have categorized them, it's very interesting and it shows, I think, what people are focused on. For instance, the people who are like, the big three groups have to have a big girl group that make the big three girl groups each is really interesting because, first of all, boy groups are usually more popular than girl groups, but also it shows like a clear fixation on the big three.
I think the other thing is that the big three in general, don't they generally debut more boy groups than girl groups?
Well, YG certainly has been lately.
Yeah. Well, like SM just debuted, they've got Rise, and then they debuted another NCT group or something like that.
Yeah, that's true.
Just like crazy.
I personally wouldn't feel comfortable speaking about it until I had some statistics, but it definitely seems that way in the public consciousness that they've debuted a lot more boy groups. Possibly because those groups have either had viral songs or they've had scandals or they've just been more generally known in the public as opposed to just their fan bases.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Actually, another thing I wanted to mention was is that so does Zero Base One definitively start fifth gen?
Well, it certainly seems that they have. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, they refer to themselves as fifth gen, everyone refers to them as fifth gen. So, I think
Yeah.
that's pretty solid now.
Ironically, I always thought like if anyone was going to be considered fifth gen, it'd probably be like New Jeans, just because how much they've blown up, I think,
Yeah, I
and just
think
how they've done things differently. Like they really brought back that Y2K like 90s vibe
mm,
back.
mm. A lot of people were trying to argue around when Zero Base One were announced as fifth gen that New Jeans had actually started it. But I don't think that particular perspective took off as much because most people were like, yeah, but other fourth gen groups had done Y2K, they just hadn't been as successful with it. And of course, previous generations had done that as well. I agree, they definitely had a really big impact, and I think they've definitely had a change on the industry, but it's less tangible than fourth to fifth gen. It's more of a like general attitude change, I think.
Yeah, because I felt like there were just definitely distinctions between each generation, like enough distinction to like justify a generation. Whereas this fourth to fifth gen is very blurry for me personally.
Yeah, definitely. For me, it might be because it's the first generational shift that we're actually experiencing. Who knows, maybe the shift from third to fourth was just as blurry at the time that it happened, but it doesn't feel as big. Like, I don't think you need to have been around at the time to know that the debut of Stray Kids was really big and the
Yeah.
debut of EXO was really big. But obviously, New Jeans had a big debut, Zero Base One had a big debut, but like, so did lots of other groups in fourth gen. What's different this time?
Actually, another theory that I came up with, I don't like it probably doesn't work. But what I thought was really interesting is that a lot of new groups now have
Mm,
a lot of pre-debut activities. Like you know
that's
how in
true.
like back when when they debuted a group, there would be like maybe like a little promo, but then they would drop like their first song and that was their debut.
Mm,
Now like these groups are releasing pre-debut like multiple pre-debut songs. They're on survival shows,
mm.
um, all of that stuff. It's just really interesting to me how these companies market these groups now by not giving them a debut until they release like a few songs. It's really interesting
Yeah,
for me.
definitely. I mean, Baby Monster, I think, is a pretty obvious example of that. Like, they were pretty solidly confirmed to be a seven-member group, but they still had this weird survival show thing happening anyway. I know they're not strictly K-pop, but like &TEAM, the Japanese boy group, they had a similar thing where it was like, well, these four members are confirmed to be in the group, but let's put them through another survival show anyway. Like, guys, they're confirmed. But then
Yeah.
obviously they still needed to have stakes about whether or not these four members would get into the group. So they were like, okay, if you guys fail your challenges, you're not going to debut at all. No one's debuting. And it was
Yeah.
like, was that really necessary? And then Zero Base One had an entire reality show before they even debuted. I definitely agree with what you're saying. I think there's a lot, like everyone's pumping out the pre-debut content now.
And it's like it's not like survival shows for groups are like a new thing. They've been
Mm,
around since like second gen, but I
mm,
think they're really like it's just they've really marketed them like really heavily. They've made like the stakes higher. I put stakes in quotation
mm,
marks for
mm,
some of these survival shows. But
mm.
yeah, it's kind of just like a whole thing. It's like now it's like how can you make a group without a survival show? It's
Yeah.
almost like that. Yeah.
And I think, obviously, it would be something we'd need to discuss further in a different episode, but I feel that some of it might be from the downfall of Produce. I've noticed that after Produce fell apart, there started becoming a lot more like very public, large survival shows. Before it was stuff like 16 and things like that. But now there's lots and lots of quite large survival shows. I feel like every day I hear that another survival show has finished or something like that.
Mm. And the thing is that these survival shows have such huge budgets. Like if you compare to 16,
Mm,
I've watched some of 16. It
mm.
is like the most low budget
Yeah.
survival show, and it's honestly so good. But now these ones have like they make them. I feel like survival shows are now like a spectacle.
Yeah, and I think they've possibly been trying to, get in on the produce space because produce kind of maybe everyone thought it was just going to go kaput. And
Mm.
then Girls Planet and Boys Planet happened, and Boys Planet was massive. So I don't know
Yeah.
how well it worked out for these companies, but like a lot of these groups seem to be pretty forgotten. I think the biggest one I can think of is Classy. And even Classy, like, I barely hear about them.
Oh,
Um,
Classy. That was
mm,
like My Teenage Girl or something. Was
yeah.
that show?
And then the second season of that was even less known. Like, I think it created Fantasy Boys. And
Yes.
Fantasy Boys had a comeback the other day, and I was like, oh, I forgot they existed. So, yeah, I think that says
Yeah.
something about how the shows went.
I agree. It's like because created like they had produced the boys and the Boys Planet Girls Planet, right?
Mm, mm.
I actually don't know who produces like the Fantasy Boys, My Teenage Girl.
Yeah, I think it might be SBS, maybe. Just because I think that's the YouTube channel that some of their videos were released on. But the only reason I know anything about those shows is because Soyeon was involved and because there was like an 11-year-old in one of them. So people freaked out about that. Like, those are the only reasons I know about it.
It's on yeah, so it's on NBC.
NBC. I knew it was one of
Yeah.
those three-letter companies. I barely knew a thing about it. Anyway, they definitely happened, let's just say that.
Hmm.
Thank you for being on this episode.
Thank you for inviting me. I think
That's
yeah, we had a really nice
okay.
conversation.
I hope you had fun. Hope that we were able to offer some insights. It's definitely good to get other people's perspectives, so I appreciate you offering that. And yeah, thank you for coming, and I'll see you next time, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hope you guys enjoyed.
K-pop generations are a very bizarre beast. They can be measured in many ways, resulting in different opinions and varying levels of success. The best way to measure them, in my opinion, by what they contribute to the industry and how they develop it, is the strongest but also the most nuanced method. It requires high levels of critical thinking, and even harder, requires subjective categorization. And even harder than that, it sometimes means that some groups, like Luna, can't nicely fit into a category no matter how hard we try. A lot of these transitional groups are the ones that experiment the most, and thus drive forward the development of the industry. We also need to note that, as the industry grows, new ideas are tried. It's bizarre to think that, potentially, Luna, Maeve, Pink Fantasy, IVE, Stray Kids, TXT, and ATEEZ could all exist in the same generation, because they all have such different ways of thinking and approaching the idol industry and the creation of their music. If we feel the need to categorize groups, we will end up with two options. Either some groups won't fit into the categories, or we will have to create a single category for each and every group, which is basically useless. Yep. So we have 4 generations for sure, each adding something else. The foundation, the growth of the industry, the addition of complex dance, and the point where the industry becomes super polished. And of course, the transitional periods between each one. So, have we reached 5th gen? Well, I know I have flip-flopped a little bit since the beginning of this episode. Yet another thing showing how unique this industry is and how nuanced the topic is. I started writing this episode very firmly believing that 5th gen hadn't begun. But now I think it has begun, but not for any of the reasons you might expect. If we go by any of the reasons I mentioned earlier, it very firmly has not begun. But I think 5th gen has begun, because we are now in an era of influencer, girl group dominated, virality obsessed K-pop. A lot of the heart, if there was any to begin with, has been lost in the past few years, and this is something that groups will have to overcome before they create a lasting legacy. We've seen time and time again that virality only leads to a group being forgotten. For instance, people like Momoland and Brave Girls. What makes a lasting impression is adding something new, something which every lasting popular group, SHINee, BTS, Girls' Generation, and more, added. 50/50 won't have a legacy, but ATEEZ and LE SSERAFIM will. The only viral group with a legacy of any type is Brave Girls, whose legacy seems to be the growth of Nugu groups, and the expansion of the industry and the beginning of the girl group boom. So yes, I do believe that 5th Gen has started, but I believe it has started because the fans of the industry and the companies believe it has started. These generations are things we believe in, they're cultural constructs, so because the industry believes it, it exists. However, this does irritate me, that fans and companies believe it has started or are saying it has started, but they never have the right reasons, and they never give the topic the nuance and understanding that it needs and deserves. 5th Gen has not yet added anything to the industry, hence, it technically doesn't exist. But it has started culturally and socially, because we believe in it as a collective. I hope that makes sense. I am still incredibly skeptical of 5th Gen for the reasons stated above, as you can see, but it has taken over the industry and is colloquially known. Me shouting into the void won't make a difference. So I will go along with it with the knowledge that when I say 5th Gen hasn't started yet, I am both correct and incorrect. Well, I hope that all made sense, at least to some degree, and I hope this doesn't sound too much like I've just been rambling without purpose for so long, although it probably does. Luckily, although next episode definitely includes some rambling, it is at least more structured rambling. But that concludes today's episode. Thank you to Mia for joining me. Thank you to you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. So, I know we just had the TLDW, but let me, as editing Casper, tell you about how my opinions have changed. I still think that my overview of the history of K-pop generations and my discussion of which categorisations of generations is good or bad is good. It's important for us to think critically about the advantages and disadvantages of each way we categorise generations, and the implications of these categories on the industry. I will say I am now more hesitant to categorise groups into generations, or to call a group the first or last group in a generation, but I still think that the discussions I made about individual groups in this video, although not necessarily accurate, are important. There are a few reasons I don't want to categorise groups anymore. First, there is so much overlap between generations, and no group will completely fit one generation. Second, this is all subjective, and nothing is really official. Don't let Mnet calling Zero Base 1 5th Gen tell you otherwise. Third, and most importantly, is something I mentioned myself in this video. We as K-pop fans have an intense need to categorise things, and to move on into the future, and I think we need to reduce this need. There is a moment where we technically move over from generation to generation, for instance when groups start becoming more polished and dancing more. But the far more important thing will always be when a generation culturally begins, when people believe it begins, not when it technically does. K-pop is socially constructed in a lot of ways, and the generations are socially constructed. Hence, they really begin when people believe they begin, regardless of what actually happens. So, I do believe that 5th Gen has begun, as I said earlier, not because it began technically, but because it began culturally with Zero Base 1, Mnet, and Kiss of Life. I personally think that a lot of the generations technically started a lot later than people believe they did, but as K-pop fans, we always want to run ahead and look to the future. I guess the message I'm trying to send is, don't just uncritically believe Mnet, or the people who run around saying that 5th Gen has started. Think critically about what generations actually mean, and thus about when they have started. Also, let's all collectively try and let go of our need for labels, and our need to always look to the future rather than appreciating the past. I am guilty of these things too, but I think it's good for all of us to let go a little bit. Just look at how Zero Base 1 mentioned their stress about being the start of 5th Gen. If we all let go a little, we can hopefully become less stressed and more peaceful as a global community. In fact, the longer I got into the editing of this video, the more uncomfortable I felt classifying groups by generations. even those we'd consider being firmly in a generation like BTS and 3rd Gen or Stray Kids and 4th. There is just so much variety in the industry and how groups present themselves that it's hard to classify them. Generations aren't clearly defined. There is a spectrum from the 1980s to now, and over that time period each group has done something slightly different, and at times K-pop has looped back on itself, like when concepts go in and out of fashion. Since it's such a subjective and artistically based industry, there is so much variation, so why even bother trying? Especially since it might not be true. No one can convince me that Hot by 17, Don't Call Me by Shiny, Dynamite by BTS, and more aren't 4th Gen comebacks. Similarly, I am very convinced that BTS's debut was very 2nd Gen, and that IOI were very 2nd Gen in many ways. Luna are seriously bizarre, since they kind of fit into all generations and none at the same time, including 5th Gen. So, yeah. I'm not going to categorize groups in the future, and I don't think it's fair to the actual nuance of the industry and the groups themselves to categorize them. But, as I said earlier, this is still an important conversation to have, and I think that the information I've discussed is still important and useful. It's just that it's less useful, since the conclusion is, well, K-pop generations are almost entirely cultural, not technical. I will clarify though, being cultural, not technical doesn't make it a bad thing, it's just cultural. Everything is cultural, so that's just how it is. Unfortunately, nuance is the only thing that can help us fully understand this industry, and nuance is something which requires critical thinking and thus is something which most people aren't educated enough to understand. As I said in episode 3, this lack of education is usually no fault of their own and we shouldn't shame them for it, but it's still a big shame. Stay in school and go to uni if you can, kids. Also, remember that in cases like these, where a concept is just that, a socially constructed concept, whatever you believe is what is true for you, and what people believe as a whole is what is true for that community. Hence, for me personally, there are no generations, and for K-pop as a community, we are entering the 5th generation. Don't forget that good old media theory concept. Representation is socialization. Anyway, that is actually really the end of the episode this time. I hope you learned something, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.